philosophy, also theology and
So
medicine was mentioned once.
medicine gets mentioned once because it doesn't stay in the liberal arts category. It gets cast out in the 500s.
Okay, so science falls into the liberal arts.
It would, so that's a good question. So let's,
It doesn't go into the humanities.
no.
No,
No,
so
it
it's got to
doesn't.
be into the liberal.
So let's start.
And why liberal, not conservative arts? I mean, geez, you know, or progressive or something. That's what liberals call themselves now.
Yeah, I would prefer they use that word because then we can keep this one.
Ah, okay.
I'm gonna rebrand.
Yes, because I'm okay with getting rid of progress to a certain extent.
Yeah.
But so let's start with a couple of terms to define. So liberal. Liberal comes from the Latin, and it's liber. It's an adjective. Liber, libera, liberum.
Okay.
And it means free. It produces or is related to words in Latin like libertas, which is liberty, freedom, and produces this idea of freedom. And the term liberal arts can be sourced back to the ancient Greeks because these were the skills. We'll go to art in a minute, but these were the skills for free people. They did have servile arts, right? That's making pots and taking care of houses. But free people, meaning people who had time, the children of oligarchs and rulers, they had the free arts, the skills that exist for making a person free. Now we don't, of course, don't live in ancient Greece, and we can use liberal arts and freedom differently and sort of more appropriately, right? It frees the mind to be thoughtful. It frees the person to be articulate and well-informed. But liberal really means free, first of all, which is why today's connotation of liberal is so strange.
Yeah.
Because there's nothing free about the way they think about the world. Classical liberalism in politics comes from the 18th century in England and deals with people like John Locke. So that ends up being a different thing. But when we talk about liberal with regards to classical education and the history of classical education, we are talking about freedom. So that's liberal. Let's go to arts, and then we'll talk about science, and then we'll talk about what you mean when you say science.
Yeah.
Because that's not what this word means first.
Oh.
Not historically.
Oh, really?
Really.
Whoa.
Yeah. You didn't know that was going to happen this morning, did you?
Ah, okay.
Arts. Arts comes from the Latin word ars, artis.
Yeah.
This means skill. And when we talk about the liberal arts, there were 7 of them. There's the trivium and the quadrivium. These come from ancient Greece and from ancient Rome and are sort of categorized by pagans first and then used by Christians raised in this environment in the 4th and 5th centuries. So Augustine in North Africa, Ambrose in Milan, Jerome, that whole, when we're talking about the 4th and 5th centuries AD, late antiquity, the liberal arts already exist as a concept that people are trained in. There are 7, right? Trivium and quadrivium. The trivium are language arts, and the quadrivium are mathematical arts.
Can I embed my smaller question right here?
Yep.
Where do the fine arts fit, or is that also one of those later things? But like sketching and music. Music isn't in quadrivium.
Music's quadrivium because it's math. But fine arts originally probably would have been called a servile art. But now, again, I'm talking historically. I can talk more broadly speaking about at the end as to how we categorize them. But if you got to take advantage of the non-existent time machine and went back to North Africa before the Vandals take it, right, in the 400s, and you talk to Augustine, when you talk about arts, he's going to talk about grammar, logic, and rhetoric.
A lot of it, I think, would be in mathematical.
Yeah.
Because you think about like painters and artists of.
If we want to use those categories and fit things in, so
It had a very mathematical aspect.
at the end of our story today, we can figure out, right, how are we going to use the categories? In some curricular planning we did as a school just before school started, and I'll share those concepts with you at the end. We'll essentially use this article as a leaping off point. I can show you the way we think about the categories right now as a school, which will alleviate your concern, Charlie, certainly, but I'm excited for this part of our discussion. So, trivium, sorry, my markers are dying. Grammar, logic, and rhetoric were the three, and that Cothran goes over in the article. Certainly in the ancient world, this just meant Latin. And grammar was taught question and answer, actually. We have a 4th century, we've got a book that even Luther will use by Donatus, a 4th century grammarian. It's just, how many parts of speech are there? 8. What are they? Name them. And it goes all the way through the grammar, like that. And that rote stuff's really good for little kids, because then when you're like discussing person in grammar, I teach the children the first person is the person speaking, the second person is the person spoken to, the third person is the person spoken about, and you recite that over and over again. And then when they're concerned, right, and I ask them a question like, what person is this verb? And they don't know. I bring them back to the thing we memorized and say it as far as they need to, and then, oh, that's right, it's second person. So that's how grammar was taught and still is. Cothran in the article talks about Sayers. Dorothy Sayers uses these by analogy to discuss stages of education. Like, grammar is the building blocks, logic is ordering them, and rhetoric is expressing them. But that argument we'll save for later, because that's an analogy. Logic, for us today, logic is mathematical. For the ancients, logic was syllogisms. So all men are mortal, Socrates is immortal, therefore Socrates is a man. And then by the Middle Ages, you're twisting those around, figuring out which ones are valid and which ones aren't for argumentation purposes. So logic is about the argument. And rhetoric is about expressing the argument. In the ancient world, Quintilian and Aristotle were the number 2 and number 1 texts that people used to learn how to speak, especially for people who it was their jobs, like say lawyers or rulers. Quadrivium, mathematical arts. Arithmetic, music, geometry, and astronomy. What is common to all 4 is number. And the way we can categorize them is plain old number, number in time, number in space, and then you can say number in space and time. And again, these 7 skills were not so much subjects as they were skills for interpreting the subjects.
Like differential equations is today.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so that ends up sort of being the point, is that although we can turn these into subjects, and that's fine, we are also equipping students with these as tools for the purpose of analyzing subjects, future future ones that we don't even know exist, or we only know them briefly, and then past ones. So these skills, these arts, are used to interpret the fields of knowledge, which is the original definition of the word science.
Mm.
So in Latin, you remember scio?
Yeah.
The verb scio means to know, K-N-O-W. And scientia is a field of knowledge. Prior to the 17th and 18th centuries, science, scientia, was philosophy, it was law, it was theology, it was history, broadly speaking. And philosophy had within it the natural sciences. So biology was part of philosophy. Because when you're pondering what it means to exist and examining your existence, you're going to encounter trees and your body and animals. And so, Aristotle does it. He writes on animals because philosophy, certainly for the pagan, is the way in which they understand the world and what's in the world, right? All sorts of things. Physics are in the world. Biology is in the world.
Yeah.
So philosophy was the way in which you engaged with that.
But I mean, astronomy, it really would be astronomy / STEM, let's say.
Well, yes, because I think the quadrivium is the age-old answer to STEM.
Yeah.
Because STEM doesn't include this.
Well, yeah. But I mean, it's somewhere subsumed in all these
Yes,
four quadriviums.
Through a liberal arts education, you get where STEM wants you to get, but more than that, because you're also reading
Yeah.
real books. Right?
That's fine. I
Yeah.
often tell engineers they got to know how to write well because they write awful.
And so all of this ends up being for the cultivation sort of the whole person,
Yeah.
as opposed to one. Question?
No, I'm just taking it all in.
I know,
It's interesting.
So science, like I said, is a field of knowledge. Before the 18th and 19th centuries, no one would hear the word science in whatever language they have and think chemistry. That happens later, which is fine, right? That's where we are today. We have to look at, say, chemistry and physics and things like that, and say how do we put them into this model? Where is the room for them? And you have to do that with lots of content areas because these are skills, not content areas. To a certain extent, we could use science, which we do in our curricular plan, as realms of knowledge, right? And then using that broad definition, add into the realms of knowledge the fields like chemistry, and that you'd use these skills to interpret.
Mm-hmm.
Fine arts we include in arts as skill now. So what? Any more history I need to do?
Where does the religion piece fit in to the 7, or does it not?
So it actually would underline them all on the one hand,
Okay.
and two, it would fit in as a field of knowledge as theology. So the highly speculative stuff was taught at the university. So we got to fast forward a little bit. By the time we're in the Middle Ages, and we've had Charlemagne and Alcuin, there's a little, it's termed the Carolingian Renaissance. It's not as nearly as well known as the Renaissance. But there were two little Renaissances prior to the one that everybody sort of knows about. The first one is the Carolingian Renaissance in the 800s. Cathedral schools, church schools, using the liberal arts to reinvigorate learning. And then there's another Renaissance in the High Middle Ages in the 12th and 13th centuries, right? 11th and 1200s, which leads to the founding of the university in the 12th and 1300s. And then you have the Renaissance. between the 800s and the 1500s, theology is being taught as a science, as a way of knowing. Prior to that, of course, in the ancient world and late antiquity, Christians are grappling with what do we do with the liberal arts, because they're heavily pagan, right? The original texts that were read in ancient Greece and Rome are Homer and Hesiod's poetry and Cicero and all of these people. And the question gets asked, I don't know if I included that article in our first semester, but what does Athens have to do with Jerusalem? Right? What does being a Christian have to do with learning? And really, the answer comes from men like Ambrose and Augustine. Jerome will participate in it, but he tells a story about a dream where he's told to choose Jesus or his books. Augustine doesn't have that problem. He sees the liberal arts as servants for the Christian life. Since the Christian life is one worked out of faith, hope, and love, you can't love people without doing something, and the liberal arts prepare you to do something. So they get wedded right around here. And there are other names that are a part of that. So then in the Middle Ages, Christianity and liberal arts education are one and the same. Through the Middle Ages, logic becomes king. And because when Aristotle gets rediscovered the first time in the 11 and 1200s, it's Aristotle's logic that rises to the very top of the university curriculum, to the point that this is where you get scholasticism and the jokes about how many angels stand on a pin, because they're spending all this time just arguing and trying to defeat each other at arguing, no matter whether it's sound or not, just disproving people. The Renaissance and the Reformation, which is where classical Lutheran education comes from, ends up being the answer. Because in the Reformation, Luther rediscovers the gospel, right? That Jesus and his death on the cross is a free gift for the salvation of sinners, not something earned. At the same time, he is being taught and raised in the liberal arts, and knowing Latin and Greek is revitalized in the Renaissance, and Hebrew is revitalized in the Renaissance. And so you have this blossoming of learning that he, one, takes advantage of, and two, sees as useful for the church. And so the liberal arts and the church are once again paired in the Lutheran context for the benefit of society, because Luther's going to push for schools. They're going to, Luther and Melanchthon, his friend at the university, change the curriculum of the university, and sort of the story goes on from there. Does that answer the Christian question?
I believe so. Thank
Cool.
you.
Oh, you're welcome. All right, other questions? Did I get your science?
Yep.
Okay. That's the one you always bring. It's important for you to bring it. Okay. So Cothran covers classical, liberal arts, and humanities.
Can I just ask on page 5,
Yep.
you talk about Common Core. My friend, who also went with me to Our Savior, he was a principal at one of the PS, I forget what it was, in the Bronx. And he talked about Common Core. It's like the thing to teach.
Uh-huh.
Is that like, how do you use it here? Or do
We
not
don't,
use-
but
we
I'll
don't.
explain why.
Yeah, okay.
Okay. Let's go to the analogy. So, grammar, logic, and rhetoric are skills, and they are subjects. But in the mid-20th century, Dorothy Sayers, who's lecturing at Oxford, gives a lecture on recovering the lost tools of learning. Because over and over again, the liberal arts and classical education has been subsumed by other things. Pragmatism, the sciences as we understand them today, industry, progress, right? What's the use of Latin, Greek, right? So Dorothy Sayers in the 40s gives a lecture, Recovering the Lost Tools of Learning. And she talks about the liberal arts, and then she explains an analogy, that grammar, and sort of a pragmatic analogy, that when we're teaching children, we actually start with the grammar of everything. It's not just English, Latin grammar or English grammar, it's math facts, it's vocabulary, right? So by using that analogy, you have grammar. Then logic is the ordering of all those pieces, and generally corresponds with, say, middle school, junior high, that by the time you've gone through elementary school, you know a lot of the pieces, and now we're working on putting them together. Think about equations, right? You don't generally learn equations in kindergarten. You learn the pieces of those complex equations, vocabulary and all that stuff, timeline. And then around high school, give or take, that is when children, are trying to put their name on things, right? Declaring sort of what they stand for, and that's the time when you're working with eloquence, trying to train their speech and their thoughts. Now that they have the pieces, they've ordered them, and now they're expressing them. The reason why I go through the analogy is that Common Core thinks that you should start with logic, so to speak. That you need to know the how before you know what you're dealing with. So they teach you how to do all the math problems before you even know that 2 + 2 = 4 as a fact. It's like instead of learning phonics, it's like learning whole words, and having to memorize those things later instead of starting with the basics of something. It can work, but the problem is if you don't know all the parts first, it's really hard to go backwards. Think about the people who take things entirely, who build something from scratch, right? They know how the whole thing works because they put every single piece together. When you start with the finished product and then take it apart, if you don't know how, right, you don't know how to put it back together because you don't know its grammar or its logic. And so Common Core, especially with regards to math, puts logic before grammar instead of using the analogy, learning the grammar first. And people complain that sometimes rote memorization isn't the most helpful because they don't understand. But to a certain extent, there are lots of things that everybody doesn't understand in all sorts of fields, and you have to start somewhere. So memorizing things, generally we make it fun, allows the children to know basic math, basic phonics, basic information, that then they can use those things. Oh, I know that, and apply it at the next level.
Well, and small children memorize things even if you don't give them something.
Yeah, so you might as well give them the right things to memorize. Right? They're going to absorb everything that they're exposed
Yeah,
to.
how many
So
3-year-olds can name every model of car that they see because that's what they've memorized? Or dinosaur names because that's what they've memorized.
or the shows that they watch and every single character on it. Right? I mean,
And
they
the
absorb
script of the show. The
Yeah,
script of the
the
show.
script of the show, the song, right? So we then, since it's already happening, we sort of take advantage of the tools that children already have. By having them memorize all of it first, because their brain's going to absorb it, and then being equipped with all those tools, it's like a toolbox. Right? When your dad was teaching you how to use a hammer and a screwdriver, he didn't start by explaining the logic, right? He taught you how to do it.
Yeah.
He gave you the fact that the hammer hits the nail, or righty tighty lefty loosey. He didn't say, well, these are the physics behind class whatever lever, and go from there. When we go here first, you have to start with the basics, so that way, when you talk about this, the children have language to express it. They have things to grab onto. But that's, at least in a nutshell, sort of the approach I would take to attacking Common Core, and how it's not pedagogically sound.
So is that like the evolution of the brain in normal people? I mean, you talked about as you move into high school, you kind of move away from just the rote memorization. But like now, like my kids remember stuff, and I'm like, where did you hear that? And we watch the same things.
Yes. So studies have shown, and this is my memory, I haven't read it recently, that age 4 is sort of like the peak of memory.
Okay.
And then how you use your memory afterwards determines how it declines.
Okay.
it's going to decline after freedom. But if you keep using it, the decline's like this.
Sure.
If you don't, then, and so the more they're memorizing, because they are doing it, the sharper their memory stays as they're taking all those things in. And then there are tricks. There are really neat tricks as to what you do with all those memories in the ancient world, but especially in the medieval period and the Renaissance. They talked about memory palaces, and you would lodge memory. People worked on lodging memories in different rooms in their head, and would sort of think through how you do this. And so you can train kids to do that too. It ended up being called the loci method, or the place method. And you can even do that today. A pastor that my grandparents had would preach based upon the stained glass windows. So when he was in the sanctuary practicing his sermon, he memorized it window by window. And so as he looked out and preached, he knew where he was in the sermon because of how he had placed those thoughts in his head. There's all sorts. There's a book, Francis Yates wrote it, on the art of memory. It's kind of thick, but it's really interesting. Sort of tracing how memory's been used. And some of the palaces that people wrote down are really, I don't know how you do it.
Right.
Layer. And they get there by like the name of a Greek god, or like Tuesday. And then you pull Tuesday out, and the drawer is sort of the decimal. Other things. So we've done, we've done liberal arts. I think it's probably worth exploring what humanities means and doesn't mean. Historically, humanities comes from the word humanitas, which is humanity. And so in the ancient world and in the Middle Ages, and certainly by the time of the Renaissance, when the word humanism first comes into use, it means the study of all those things that are important for being a human. Not necessarily arts and literature only, but because literature, poetry, history does have such a great bearing on humanity, that's why we associate them with that now. Because those were the things they studied as part of what, studies that make a person a human, sort of contribute to the fullness of understanding humanity. And I think that's sort of the way it'd be helpful to go, right? Is that the humanities are the things we use for studying and understanding humanity. Since humanity doesn't really change. It's one of the reasons why history is such a profitable study. And why literature is a profitable study. Because you are examining people, either the author or the characters, and people, although the things that they want and desire change in their, I'm going to use a philosophical term, they change in their accident, meaning in what they look like. They don't generally change in their substance. People have always wanted possessions of some kind. There's always envy in humanity, whether it's a phone or something in the Middle Ages. It's still the same sinful instinct from the vice perspective or from the virtue perspective, right? Bravery can be found in any age. And so those humanities are then very important because we are humans. And to understand how other people think, how they feel, what is true and good and beautiful about how they think and feel, that's the study of humanities. He does some more in there too, but that's where I would go with it. Classical really does mean Greece and Rome, and as a term sort of hits on Western Civ. But we could say Greece, Rome, and Jerusalem for the purpose of, as a Christian school, as a Lutheran school, we aren't interested in revitalizing paganism. We do see, but we are willing to plunder the Egyptians, so to speak, and to use the things that humanity has created, apart from God, to serve God and our neighbor. That's Luke 16, the make wise for yourself, make friends through the use of unrighteous mammon, right? The unjust steward. We have unrighteous mammon, so to speak, in terms of the poets and the Iliad and the Odyssey, and it teaches us something that we can use, even though we're not from the same context or something like that. Other thoughts? I forget what I chose for the next article. It's written down somewhere.
Quick question, in here he refers to an inflected language. What does he mean by inflected?
So inflected language is a language where the endings change to show you their use in speech.
Oh, okay, yeah, that makes sense.
English is a little bit inflected,
Yeah.
right? The best example is in pronouns.
Right.
Right? We can't say him went to the store. Doesn't make sense. You have to say he, because that's the subject. Latin, Greek, German, Russian, Finnish are all inflected, and heavily inflected, where the ending of the word shows you how the word is used almost all the time. Right? So we memorize declensions in Latin because the ending of the noun tells you if it's the subject or the object of a preposition or the possessive or the indirect object, instead of using prepositions like we do in English. We call those things cases. Latin has 5, really 6 cases. German has 4. Russian has 6. Finnish has 16.
Holy moly.
There are hardly any separable prepositions in Finnish. They use cases to express almost every relationship you can have between words. Greek has 4. And those things have colored how we talk about language. Nominative, genitive, dative, accusative, and
Ablative. I remember that from Latin.
Yeah.
Brother, that first time I heard the word used.
I used in Roswell, no green dog aliens allowed, as the way to memorize the 5 cases. Nominative is the subject.
Yep.
Genitive is possessive and other things. But the use of the word of. Dative is, this is my wife, her brain's exploding now. Dative is 2 or 4. Accusative is the direct object, right? I see him, accusative. And then ablative is kind of a catch-all, but generally you can understand it as something requiring in, by, with, or from. One of the books I taught from calls it the if-with case, in, by, with, from, as a way to do it. Greek doesn't have an ablative. They have the other 4. German has the other 4. Russian doesn't have all 5 of those, it has 2 others. But that's inflected. We're used to inflecting verbs to a certain extent, but in the other languages, verbs also are changed a lot. I mean, literally, inflection means to bend in. So we're sort of bending into words, changing you've got a base, and then the end changes. You came with all the questions. Good. You have more?
Well, just one really an interesting comment. They have a theoretical debate with the CEO of a company, and he said, the majority of our employees are communications people. When we get them here, we have to train them in problem-solving skills that they just don't have. So why is that?
Well, because no one's taught logic. Logic, so critical thinking, which is a very common term.
And that's what you're going to try to get around with this classical.
Well, you get it
without getting the bad form of that, right? It's more of a self-realization almost.
Yeah. What can you, if you don't know anything, what can you think about it?
Right.
And how can you think about it critically if you, right? So the grammar and the logic allow you to, quote unquote, critically think, to actually engage with something. We're so used to being told, so this is also Cothran, we're used to being taught what to think and how to do things.
Right.
Instead of how he puts it, which I use a lot, how to think and what to do.
Right.
And that takes a lot of retraining for us. The nice thing is, and our teachers talk about it here, our kids have a different mindset. Our students, as we've seen the big influx of of public school kids this year, the teachers can see the difference. One that will happen in a year or two for the ones who come here, that the way they approach thought is different. The way they approach content is different because we're training them classically as opposed to just feeding them information.
Rote memorization, you mean?
Well, no, I mean, rote memorization is fine. It's the filling up analogy. Instead of, teaching through conversation, through engaging lecture is different than cutting open a child's head and pouring the information in.
Yeah.
And even at public school, K-12, Long Island, New York, they're still cutting open the head and pouring the information in. They're not teaching you how, even at the lowest level.
Right.
They're not teaching how. There's no real engagement with the material to make a student. Last Latin word for you for today, student. Studeo, studere. It means to be eager. That's what the verb means. So technically, although certainly not true, students are supposed to be eager learners. That's etymologically what the word means. And classical Lutheran education actually produces it. It produces a love for learning. It produces a mindset. I love it when the teachers say things that I've been working with them on or that they've been living but haven't realized it. It's really cool. They can see it, the eagerness and the ability to grapple and think through things happening even in 4th grade. It's not something we're just sort of waiting for later. They're already engaged in that way of approaching stuff. And that's just not how we were raised. It's not how the schools we went to were created and thought of, because progressive education infiltrated religious institutions a long time ago in America. But that's a topic for a different day. I don't know if I have that on the list, but it's a topic for a different day. All right, it is time for chat.
All right.
Thank you. Yeah,
Welcome.
enjoyed it.
Great. Every month we'll do this.
First Friday of the month.
First Friday. Yep. It's before.
Should be fine.
It's before the baby. Baby's due October 5th. The first Friday is before October 5th, so
Yeah, so
we're good.
Just hold it there. You know.
Knowing what happened with number 4,
It's,
that's a little trickier of a prospect.
oh, okay. So you may be out that day, is what you're saying.
No, probably not that early.
I didn't know you'd have that date. My brother's wife is the day after October 6th.
Oh,
Yeah.
I'm sure people said on there, Allison, that
No, that'll be
I'm
easy
out of
to
the free.
remember.
But